All right, hello everyone, welcome. Give everybody a chance to join the webinar before we get going here. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a huge list of people signed up today, so it's going to take a while to get everybody in, but welcome to the first of our masterclass series on Social Security. It's going to be a 5-part series, and we will be announcing next week's topic today at the end of the class, but we'll have 3 other sessions as well, all of them really full of amazing content. We're going to be talking about the psychology of Social Security, taxation, claiming for spousal benefits, survivor benefits, divorce situations. There's all sorts of stuff going on in this masterclass, so I hope you can continue taking part as we go through the next about 2 months. So just as everybody is getting into the class, some housekeeping items. So as I said, this is session 1 of a 5-part masterclass on Social Security. This session is available for 1 hour of CFP CE credit. You do have to attend at least 50 minutes live, and no, it doesn't count if your AI note taker is on here, but you're not. You will get a post-webinar survey so that we have your CFP number, and we will send out a survey in 24 hours that you can also give us your information there. And we'll be sending out some of the content from this session and others in the future. Also, if you've been on our webinars before, you know we get tons and tons of questions. I'm going to try to leave time at the end for some Q&A. We do have a ton to get through today, though, so I apologize if we don't have time for everybody's questions. What you can do to help me out is upvote. And well, first of all, put the questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. You're welcome to use the chat, but I won't be monitoring that, and our team won't be monitoring that, necessarily. Although actually, the team will probably monitor the chat. But use the Q&A for questions, and then upvote them if you want to see them answered. That really helps us out because it's really almost impossible to follow the chat. So with that, got a lot to get through today. So we will just take off. So all right. So today's session is the first of our masterclass. And so I want to start with kind of the most obvious, the most central question to Social Security claiming and Social Security planning, which is just obviously, when do I claim? It turns out the Social Security system in the United States, it gives you the option to begin benefits anywhere between age 62 and 70. So the core question is, when do I claim? It's core because Social Security is incredibly important to people. For a lot of people, it's the foundation of their financial plan and retirement. And even for those who have maybe more resources outside of Social Security, it can still be foundational. So it's a really big deal. But we're going to go beyond today, some of the basics of how people think about this question, and really focus on what I'm calling the underappreciated risks related to claiming decisions. So these are things that maybe are a little less commonly thought about, or at least explored in the way that we're going to explore them today. And that's longevity and mortality risk, opportunity cost and sequence of return risk, and funding risk. And don't worry, we'll go over exactly what all those are. All right. So first of all, the core question, when to claim. So Social Security claiming, as I said, because any one person can claim between age 62 and 70, it actually presents us this classic time preference problem. So it's the sort of thing that that economists love to study, right? It's basically hey, is it worth it to give up something today, or in this case at 62 if you're younger than that, in exchange for something more but further down the road, right? Like, how do I consider my options when I'm faced with this question of 2 different things at 2 different times? So again, this is the kind of thing that you can do lots and lots of experiments on, right? It's kind of part of what's behind things like interest rates in the world, right? Why would someone be willing to, give the bank some money in exchange for more money in the future, right? This is just a classic part of economics, and that's at the core of the Social Security claiming question, because if I claim at 62 and I'm getting $1,000, I also have many other options. In fact, um, you can claim at any month between 62 and 70. So I'm only showing, the 9 ages on the screen here, but there are many, many more options in between. And for a couple, they both have these options. So you end up with more than 9,000 possible combinations, and it can get even more complex in other situations. So it's a massive set of possible choices. But you can see there's a pretty big difference between the amount I would get at age 70 and the amount I'd get at 62. It's a little over 77% more benefit at 70 than at 62. But of course, in order to get that 77% more, I have to wait all the way to age 70 and get nothing beforehand, right? So this is, although that seems like a lot of money, that's a very big difference. So how do people approach this claiming decision? Well, there's an approach that I'm calling the just the math approach, which just focuses on what I just showed you, essentially. Just think about what are the benefit amounts at each claiming point, how long might I live, figure out total lifetime benefits, and that's how you would make your decision. Just choose the highest option. That might be a little bit of a character of some of what you've seen out kind of in, you know, uh, articles and things on the internet, but it's a decent summary of how people sometimes approach this question. What I'm going to be arguing for here is that actually Social Security claiming is much more complicated. So we should consider, of course, projected lifetime benefits, right? The amounts that we would receive depending on our choice. But we also need to think about risks and uncertainties, preferences, and the place of Social Security in the broader retirement plan. In other words, the Social Security claiming decision is not going to be just a straightforward thing that we can just focus on with blinders on, or put under a microscope, just look at Social Security and choose the one with the highest number. This is actually just like other things in financial planning, which is there's a complex set of risks and preferences involved and interplay with other parts of a financial plan. And so although it can be helpful to just focus on one small part, it is actually, to get a good plan, we need to think about things outside of it and just recognize things are complicated. But to step back and give kind of a just the math example, one way we can think about making a Social Security claiming choice is just looking at something called break-even age. So this would say, all right, if I'm going to delay Social Security, how long would I have to live so that the total benefits I've received are equal to or greater than how much I would have received if I started as soon as I could? Because starting as soon as I could is typically, that's often our preference, right? If I say, hey, I'll give you 20 bucks today, or in a year, I'll give you, 21, you probably just take the 20 bucks today, right? So most people kind of prefer, money today, right? So if I do that using no discount rate, meaning I'm valuing a dollar at 90 the same as I value a dollar at 82 or at 62, and we'll come back to that assumption, but then I would have to live, for example, past 80 and a half to make waiting till 70 a decision that got me the same amount of money as claiming at 62. So this is the sort of thing you'll often see if you kind of search the internet for commentary on, when should I claim Social Security. Okay, so let's go beyond that though. Let's go to the underappreciated risks of to consider in the claiming decision. And we're going to start with mortality and longevity risk. These risks are kind of two sides of the same coin. They're, the risk of living a long time and the risk of not living a long time. And I've written some on this in the Kitsis blog on mortality risk as kind of an underappreciated risk in financial planning in general. And at Income Lab, in our software, I think we're still the only software that actually takes mortality risk into account in the overall plan, which is a really big deal. So in the case of Social Security, it's an especially big deal because if you're planning for uh, a joint household, so there are two Social Securities, if someone dies, one of those goes away. And so mortality risk is a really big deal in overall financial planning, especially in those that have Social Security in them. But the way I'm referring to mortality and longevity risk today is more about how people think about their possible lifespan, considering whether to claim Social Security early or late. And those who tend to want to claim early, their internal monologue, or what they might say to an advisor, might be something like, "Well, I'm worried that if I delay claiming, I might die earlier than I'd hoped, and I'll end up getting less than I'd hoped, a lot less maybe." Um, so that person is concerned more about mortality risk, right? The chances of dying. And they're more concerned about optimizing income at younger ages. Those who think about this and it leads them to claim late might be thinking, I'm worried that I'll live a long time and that in my old age, my benefits won't be as high as they could have been. And therefore, I might have less, right? They're more concerned about longevity risk and they're more concerned about what income looks like at older ages. So that's the opposition I want to put in place here in terms of longevity and mortality risk. So now let's think about what if these risks go wrong, right? What if a choice that someone makes about claiming turns out to have been a bad choice? And I want to set up a framing of this so that we can understand how people think about these risks. And it's a framing I've set up before in other webinars and in some of my talks at conferences, and it comes from a book by Peter Sandman in 2012 called Responding to Community Outrage: Strategies for Effective Risk Communication. And one thing Sandman does is he sets up this equation where he says risk equals hazard plus outrage. What does he mean by that? He means that the risk that we perceive in the world is a combination of the hazard, which is the thing that might happen, how bad it would be if it happens, and the chances it might happen, and this other thing called outrage, which is basically how we feel about it. And he finds that there's this opposition between things that make us more outraged about particular risks and things that make us less outraged. And I think if you consider yourself, you'll find he's right. So things that are more outrageous and therefore feel riskier are catastrophic. They're dreaded, they're memorable, they're coerced, they're unfair, versus things that are less outrageous, that are chronic, not dreaded, not memorable, voluntary. Let's take catastrophic versus chronic. This is why people might be more afraid of, a plane crash than high cholesterol. It's why people might be more alarmed and upset about a market crash than about inflation. Both of those things are risks. They actually both can affect your retirement plan in the case of market crash and inflation, but you get a lot more phone calls during a market crash than in a case where inflation ticks up a bit. So using this structure of this is how people perceive risk. And by the way, just because we're talking about outrage as a separate thing and it's about perception, doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, this is very much real. Even knowing about it doesn't change our feelings. And we're talking about perception of risk here. Okay, so let's look at Social Security claiming and think about in what situations could things go quote unquote wrong, right? When did we make a bad decision if we're just thinking about claiming? Well, there's two of them. It's a case where we have a mismatch. So we could either have a short life, but we claimed late or we're planning to claim late, or we have a long life and we claimed early. Well, let's put ourselves in this situation. Let's say we decided to claim late. Yep, I read all the articles and I'm convinced that claiming at 70, 77% more benefit, that sounds great.
And then at 68, I'm diagnosed with terminal cancer. We probably all know people, maybe some of your clients have been in this situation, right? It's a thing that I can imagine. It feels catastrophic because the situation where I die younger is often that kind of a thing where it's sort of a sudden catastrophic change in life. It's memorable, meaning I can imagine what it's like, right, in my brain, and it feels a little bit unfair because, well, I could have claimed earlier, and now I'm not going to get, my benefits that I put so much of my payroll taxes in, over decades of my working years. It just feels unfair, and so that's a more outrageous situation, and it feels riskier according to Sandman's approach to risk. Let's think about the other mismatch. Long life, but I claimed early. So I claimed at 62, let's say, and now I hit 85, 90, and I look back on that decision and think, I actually could have claimed later, and probably that would have been worth it to me, and I would have been getting more now. How risky or how outrageous does that situation feel, even imagining it ahead of time? Okay, well, you're living a long life. That's not a negative. Um, this happens slowly over time, so it's on the chronic, not catastrophic side. It's not really dreaded. I can't imagine thinking, oh no, that's terrible. It was voluntary. I made the choice, and it's fair. I took it early. I was getting my money from 62. Okay, I get a little less now. So just imagining how people perceive these two mismatches, they're very different. The short life but claimed late feels much more risky to people. And because of that, those who worry even a little bit about mortality risk um, will perceive a higher risk to claiming late and will be motivated to claiming earlier. So let's look at ways that you can explore mortality risk and that decision-making process. This is just a set of longevity curves or survivorship curves for people to give us a feel for what sorts of age ranges might be reasonable. So Social Security actually puts the life expectancy of a 62-year-old man at 81.7 and a woman at 84.5. But often, for example, in Income Lab software, we use Society of Actuaries um, numbers for retirement plan participants. That basically says, people with more assets, more resources do tend to live longer. That's a well-known process set of data. So, this gives you kind of a feel for, all right, we're kind of looking in the 80s is a good takeaway here. So I'm going to switch over, and when we send these slides out, you'll have slides for these, but I want to use um, the Income Lab, Decision Lab, Social Security Optimizer to demonstrate what this looks like. So here I have a heat map showing, in this case, all 9,000 plus possible times that John and Mary can claim here. Both John and Mary are before age 62, so they have all of their choices are ahead of them. And if their financial plan puts them at goes through, let's say, 2059, and so they're in their mid 90s, and they really do live that long, then yeah, claiming at age 70 looks really good. One thing that's interesting here that you'll see, I've turned on highlighting, that's this green line, that shows me every claiming option that's within 1.5% of the most. So here I'm projecting 1.6 million in total lifetime benefits for the two of them if they live as long as this. But down here, I could claim 4 years earlier for Mary, and I'd only be giving up $23,700 over their entire lifetime, right? So often one thing I think that people want to know is, yeah, okay, I see that that's the quote unquote optimal, but how much worse is claiming at a slightly earlier age, and so that's what this green line is meant to show. Because I think we should recognize most people actually would prefer to claim as early as possible, and then they need to be convinced to claim later for some reason. All right, so let's explore some ages. Let's put John and Mary more into the more the average life expectancy range, and just apply the changes, and boom, we can see already we've gone from 70 and 70 to
68 and 66, and our close enough range would allow us to claim as early as 62 for Mary. I guess I should have said I purposely set John and Mary up where so that they would have a spousal benefit and survivor benefits and things. So John's primary insurance amount, meaning the amount he would receive at full retirement age, which for both of them is age 67. His is 3,000 and Mary's is 1,000. So in other words, if we went back to that graph that we had earlier, at 67, the amount that you see on this graph at 67. So in this case, 1429, that's what's called primary insurance amount, and age 67 for them is what's called full retirement age. That matters for a bunch of other things. We're not going to go into those definitions right now. It has to do with things like what if you earn income before, while you're taking Social Security, and so on. But the only thing we need to know now is that kind of age 67 is sort of a special age. Okay, let's go back to the and that explains why Mary can take a little bit earlier in this case. But you already see just by moving life expectancy more toward an average, we understandably move the optimal claiming date a lot earlier. And you can see even if the difference between optimal of 927,000 and close enough here, it's only 13,700 over an entire lifetime, right? Over, between now at 62 and, for example, 64, so, or 84. So, we're talking 22 years. So that's a big deal. But often what people want to explore is, well, let's look at other situations. Look, maybe I have somebody in my family who, died in their 70s. Maybe, no man ever made it past, 75, right? These are very common situations that people worry about. And as soon as I do that, my optimal shifts remarkably and my close enough as well. So this is one of those situations where, yes, maybe the financial plan in general plans into the 90s because we're worried about longevity risk. We're worried about, hey, let's just make sure that if we do happen to live a long time, we'll have the assets, the resources to still fund our lifestyle. But the fact is that's not particularly likely. It's okay to plan for it, but when thinking about optimizing Social Security, often people do want to at least explore average life expectancy type numbers and then also explore some extremes just to really get a feel for it and to look at what they're really giving up, what's at stake, right? And in this case, what's at stake is actually often not very much if they're choosing some quote unquote less optimal options. All right. The next risk that we want to look at is sequence of return risk. And I think this one is really not appreciated in the commentary on Social Security claiming. So we'll spend a decent amount of time on this. And it, again, has to do with that concept I mentioned earlier about, hey, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, right? It's this whole should I delay thing. Why? Why do we feel that way? Well, it's a preference for current consumption over delayed gratification. It's a preference for a sure thing over something uncertain. Why would Social Security be uncertain? Well, lots of reasons, but one of the most obvious is I might not be around to get it in the future, whereas I know I am today. And there's a last one that's a little more subtle, but we'll talk about it, which is a substitution effect. If I don't have Social Security coming in, where will the money come from, right? So if I'm retiring at some point and I have a choice between taking Social Security or not, I'll still want to live on my resources. So Derek Tharp and I wrote years ago about this concept of the retirement distribution hatchet, which by that we meant that portfolio withdrawals in a retirement plan where someone delays Social Security or other things like pensions can have a look of a hatchet, where there's a head of the hatchet where there's a lot of withdrawals early on, and then there's less once you take Social Security because now you don't have to take as much because you have Social Security. One thing that's going to come into play here is what's called sequence of return risk. Many of you probably know what that is, but it's always worth a refresher. It's the concept that if you are withdrawing money from an account, actually, even if you're adding money, this comes into effect, but the typical situation is we want to talk about it when you're withdrawing money. The order in which you get returns matters. If you get good returns early and bad returns late, that's better than if you get bad returns early and good returns late. So in this example, I use the exact same returns, but just flipped them on their head for the bad sequence. And you can see that the same withdrawals, I took $50,000 out each year out of $1 million portfolio, but a different sequence of returns leads to a $72,000 difference in balance after 5 years. And obviously, we could see larger differences over a longer period of time. Um, your math teacher would be proud if you just, remembered sort of order of operations and, subtraction and multiplication here. That's all this is. It's just math that leads to this sequence of return risk. So the concept that we want to look at here is substitution. How does sequence of return risk interact with Social Security claiming? Because if I forego $1 of Social Security now, or at 62, or at 65, but I'm retired, that dollar will have to come from my portfolio instead. So the question is, what's the effect of that fact on the overall retirement plan, including investment balances? So let's go back to the software we're looking at here, and I'm going to go to an example that I've created, and I created this as in a really, really simple way. This is something called the retirement stress test in Income Lab. And what it's doing is walking a specific retirement plan through different sequences of returns and inflation. And what I've done is created a really simple plan where there's one person, age 62, with $1 million and Social Security. We can look at, just to remind us what the, okay, and $1 million, and then the Social Security, at age 62 is 2,100. So I think this was maybe a $3,000 primary insurance amount. So it's reduced because I'm not taking at 67, I'm taking at 62. All right, and if I go to the retirement stress test, we have all these scenarios across the top. I'm looking at the global financial crisis, and I'm going to compare this person taking at 62 with $1 million and at 70 with $1 million. For those of you who know Income Lab, you know that Income Lab plans also they plan for income adjustments over time, meaning if things get bad, you'll take a pay cut rather than allow things to get really bad. And if things get good, you'll go ahead and spend more. So it keeps people on track, make sure they're always spending within their means. That means that there are these things called guardrails on the in the plan that tell you when you would make an adjustment. I've removed those here. So because I'm just trying to kind of give a really clean picture of what things would look like, and I've made the income, the total income between my portfolio withdrawals and my Social Security, I've made it flat over time, just adjusted for inflation, and I've made them basically the same as much as I could. So we're getting about 6260 in total in monthly income for both of these plans, whether I take it Social Security at 62 or at 70. Those who use Income Lab know that actually there's a way of asking, instead of how can I spend exactly this much, there's a way of asking how much can I spend, and typically if you claim early in Social Security, you'll have to spend a little bit less than if you claim late. But I've made them the same here. In fact, I've made claiming early spend a bit more. So the question is, how does that difference in when Social Security is taken affect the portfolio? Because we have this opportunity cost. We have this substitution effect where by claiming Social Security early, I don't have to take as much from my portfolio, right? If I'm taking 6,200 in total income, but I think it was 2,100 is from Social Security, I only have to take 4,000. Whereas if I'm waiting till 70, I've got to take the full 6,200 from my portfolio.
So in this situation, we can see predictably the case where I claim late, and so I'm taking a lot more money out early. Um, that's the kind of mustard colored line. The balance is going to be a lot lower. And by 2016 here, again, I started with $1 million. Actually, I'm going to switch this to be nominal, meaning that actual dollars people would have spent. So now you can see inflation adjustments, but just to give a better feel for the balances, since your your uh, your statements don't come in constant dollars, they come in nominal dollars. So okay, so the difference here we can see is about $300,000. In many cases along the way. This is a really big difference, right? I mean, just imagine the experience of someone taking Social Security early. It's the blue one, right? So they're recovering faster compared to the yellow one. So there's just a lot more concern. You can see here by 2013, we still have not recovered much from 2009 if we're still delaying Social Security. Um, so this is a sequence of return effect. Um, we can look at that situation. We can also say, well, what if we started this, you know, after the big market crash, or kind of, a little bit, don't subject it to as big of a difference. And here, interestingly, we still see a pretty big difference. So again, about that $300,000 difference over time if we had claimed early. So this is also a sequence of return effect, but both of them have to do with how much money is left in the account to experience whatever returns we got. So in the case of hitting it with the global financial crisis, we're not withdrawing as much, and so we're not kind of making things worse by taking money out in down markets. And in the case of a better market, we're leaving more in order to take part in the recovery. So in both cases, we actually are seeing an advantage to claiming early. So now you might say, well, is that always true? And that's a great question. There are situations, let me see if I can find one here. Yeah, I think if I do this, where late in the plan, here we go. So this is the worst one I could find. Late in the plan, they flip-flop. And so here we're 20 years in, right? So we're into our 80s, and finally claiming late is performing better. Why? Well, it's because at this point, I'm not having to withdraw as much from the portfolio as I would have had to if I had claimed early and didn't have as high of Social Security. Those of you who know Income Lab are probably wondering what this would look like with guardrails in place, and fair enough, because the fact is most of the time people are not going to just kind of let things move in such a big way. So I'll just give you a quick example of a plan with guardrails. And here we can sort of see, okay, with guardrails, even in this situation, actually, the blue line stays in better shape. One thing I'm also ignoring in this example, because I've used just one person, is the mortality risk associated with one spouse dying. So we don't have time for it today, but that effect is actually pretty big because if one spouse dies, let's say they both had, $3,000 in Social Security, you're going to be left with not 6,000, but 3,000 if one dies, and you have to make up for that, at least to some extent, from your portfolio. So when you add mortality risk, in the sense that if someone dies, there's not as much resources to fund the surviving spouse's lifestyle to it, this actually becomes a much bigger effect. So again, using kind of stress testing with real sequences of returns, we can see that claiming early has this sort of buffer effect on the portfolio. Doesn't always mean things work out better, but it usually means that at least early in the plan, again, maybe through the 80s, somebody has more resources to play with if they claim early.
All right, so this just summarizes what we just looked at. So if you claim early in a bad sequence of returns, it's a positive because lower withdrawals into a bad market allows the portfolio to recover faster. Claiming early and having a good sequence of returns is also a positive because lower withdrawals into a good market allows more participation in the good markets and increases portfolio size. By the way, I'm using about a 60-40 portfolio here. Um, the effects would be different depending on what the portfolio is. And one other thing is I removed the guardrails there, but if you do have a higher portfolio, that also means you can potentially support higher withdrawals in the future. So when we test this, again, with guardrails, we often see that even claiming Social Security early, even though that means you might have to spend a bit less toward the beginning of, at the very beginning of retirement, often because of those higher portfolio withdrawal, because of those higher portfolio balances, rather, you'll hit the upper guardrail and get pay raises and wipe out the difference between claiming early and claiming late that we often see in the initial retirement paycheck or spending capacity that people have. What about claiming late? Well, in both these situations, we see a negative. Higher withdrawals into a bad market, not good. And actually, higher withdrawals into a good market also means less participation in good markets. However, the caveat is you can find situations where if you live long enough, they'll flip over. So you'll have claiming late can be advantageous later in life, but you do have to live longer. So that leads us back to the mortality and longevity risk slide, where it's sort of what's somebody worried about and what are they focused on. If they're focusing on their experience and kind of the earlier years, the go-go years, or even the slow-go years, claiming early tends to be advantageous when you look at sequence of return risk. And in some, but not all situations, you can have an advantage, at least if you don't have any guardrails and don't make adjustments for claiming late. There is another way to look at this. We're going to spend more time on this in future master classes. But you can, so what I just used was the stress test. And I actually think this is a really great way to kind of paint a picture for people because that's real data. It's not theoretical in the sense that we know sequences of returns like that can happen. So let's see what happens. But there is this other more theoretical concept that I think everybody's pretty comfortable with, which is called a discount rate, or we call it an opportunity cost, which is just that concept of how much more is a dollar today worth to you than a dollar tomorrow. Um, and you actually can apply a discount rate to Social Security and look at those break-even ages again. And here I've applied a 4% discount rate, which would be equivalent to saying in real terms, so if you added inflation, this might be 6 or 7%, but in real terms, how much is that substitution worth to me? Is a dollar that I leave in my account going to earn 4%, net of inflation? If so, this would be a discount rate that you'd apply. And you can see that the break-even rate, break-even point, break-even age pushes out quite a bit. So for age 70, for example, it's almost, it's 6.5 years. And that can really change your decision making as well. So if we go back to the heat map we were looking at, let's say I just want to add an opportunity cost, and maybe I'm going to add these slowly. So I'll add 2% at first. I'm going to keep my life expectancy the same. And so you can see the big change here. As I get it higher and higher, it's going to move down and to the left. And by the way, my close enough range is also getting much bigger because the differences for claiming late are just, they're getting smaller because a dollar in the future is worth so much less. In fact, now the difference between my optimal claiming, which is at age 67 and 62, and just taking at 62 and 62, it's 59, 52. It's $6,000 over a lifetime, right? This is the kind of thing that would most people, understanding the uncertainty of how long they might live, they're just going to shrug at that difference. Like it's kind of a who cares type thing. So adding opportunity cost, and if I add it to 4%, I'm assuming I'll go all the way Yeah, now I'm all the way down on the left. So you can kind of see how by discounting those future cash flows and saying, yeah, those aren't worth as much to me, either because I might not be alive or because I'm going to have to use my portfolio. That's all very real for people, and you can see how the optimal claiming date and sort of the close enough ranges change a lot. So one way to look at this is to use the stress test, and I think that the great thing about that is it lets you imagine, oh, okay, what would this have felt like as I watched my portfolio over time, and I probably would have preferred my portfolio to be a little in better shape. Another way is simply to look at lifetime benefits, but include an opportunity cost. And there's a lot of kind of disagreement out there on what opportunity cost to use, if any. Um, and happy to take questions on that if people have them. Okay, the last risk we're going to hit today is funding risk, and I think this is probably the one that's most on people's minds, and it has to do with potential changes in the Social Security program, or you might call this policy risk. So if you learn about Social Security and how it works, it can be tempting to think that that's always how it's worked, right? If you learn about, oh, you can claim between 62 and 70, and full retirement age is 67, and if I wait between 67 and 70, I get 8% more per year as I wait, and there's a reduction in those benefits before 67, and so on. That is the way things work today, but actually Social Security has changed a lot in the past. So the first benefit was paid in 1940. There were no early retirement options then. So full retirement age was 65. They added early retirement for women in 56. They added it for men in 61. COLAs were sort of irregular and ad hoc until 72. So that's cost of living adjustments. The benefit formula in general was massively changed in 1977. Before that, it was done in really weird ways that included essentially giving people double indexing for inflation. In the 80s, early 80s, there was a huge worry about the viability of the program. So there were massive changes in 1983 that gave us essentially what we have today, not quite, but very close. It increased payroll taxes. It introduced taxability of benefits. It increased full retirement age. It increased delay credits to encourage people to wait. The changes to taxability were introduced again in 1994, and then some changes also came in the year 2000. So one of the takeaways here is just that, no, things have changed a lot over time. People often wonder, okay, when they change, how do they change? How quickly are changes implemented? Here are a few examples of things that were applied either quickly or with a delay. So often you see here that either things apply immediately. So for example, early retirement, it was not extended to people who, were not of a certain age. So that was a new good thing, but it was not allowed for people below a certain or over a certain age. The new benefit formula in 77 applied after a 2-year delay. And the 83 changes had the biggest grandfathering effect. There was a 20-year delay in that new full retirement age. So moving it from 65 to 67. It only applied to people who were 45 or younger when that change went into effect. And taxability, generally, that's applied immediately. So one way to look at this is tax changes tend to happen the next tax year. Major changes to ages or structure have generally had some kind of grandfathering or delay. What about, the health of the program? Well, it's gone between having surpluses and having deficits. So we've run deficits before. We ran them before 1983. In fact, there were really major worries about the viability of the program in the early 80s. And there was the Greenspan Commission. That's actually how Greenspan kind of came to the public eye and later became Fed governor for Fed chairman. So, I mean, the projections were that the program would go insolvent within less than 2 years at that point. And so that's where those big changes came into effect. And then we had payroll taxes exceeding benefits paid after that, before we went back into deficit in 2010. So warnings of insolvency, they've been there in the past, and most currently, the most recent one says if no changes are made, they're projecting that by 2033, only 77% of benefits will be payable. So there'd be a across the board 23% cut in benefits currently being paid. That is not to say that's what will happen. No one knows what will happen. But this fact that that's what the trustees are currently projecting is definitely causing clients a lot of worry. And we can look back and see how those projections have changed over time. So the blue line is when did the trustees expect things to go bad? And you can see it's kind of been in the 2030s or 2040s. And the red lines are projected cuts to benefits or inability to fund everything. This gets a little complex because there is more to Social Security than just what's called old age benefits or retirement benefits. So you'll see slightly different numbers depending on whether you're looking at disability and supplemental and so on. But in general, what we see here is for a long time, people have thought, okay, we'll run into trouble in the 2030s or 2040s. Currently, benefits are being funded by payroll taxes, by tax on benefits, by interest income from U.S. government government bonds, which are held in the quote unquote trust fund, and by redemption of reserves, meaning we're actually working through those government bonds. And so you can see, why, because it's not entirely funded by payroll taxes, that's where the problem comes from. All right, so let's go back to our heat map, and I will go ahead and turn off opportunity cost for now, and ask, okay, what if we assume that that reductions do happen in 2033? Okay, as expected, we go down and to the left, right? Because now we're saying that future benefits will not be as high as we expected, right, after 2033. And so the total lifetime benefits would go down if I'm waiting a lot longer. You don't have to assume it's 2033. You don't have to assume a 21% reduction. You might say, oh no, I expect huge changes. You might say, no, I expect small changes. But this is the kind of thing that, acknowledging people's worries about this is very important, because they're seeing articles about it. I know the Wall Street Journal had some big articles about this, and it's definitely worth exploring this. You can push it out a few years. It's the kind of thing that is not usually considered in sort of back of the envelope approaches to these sorts of what's the best claiming decision, but very much can be done. Again, I don't think anybody actually knows what changes, if at all, may happen, when they'll happen, and so on. But this is kind of one of those, until recently, more underappreciated approaches. And you can see by layering in things like more average life expectancy, stress testing the benefits themselves, and including some opportunity costs, it just tends to move things down and to the left. All right, so just to summarize, should I claim early or late? What we've gone over today, these kind of less appreciated risks, they tend to move people more toward claiming early, or at least make it legitimate and not crazy to think about claiming early. I do want to acknowledge, though, that there are considerations that can lead people to want to claim later. One of them we'll talk about next week, which is taxes. So if you have particularly high income early, before age 70, that can push Social Security into higher taxability. That may be a reason to claim later. Or if you have higher earnings, that may push you toward claiming later. But what we've gone over today, mortality risk, funding risk, or policy risk, and opportunity cost or sequence of returns, they do all make people think more about claiming earlier. basically mortality risk is that thought of, okay, yeah, maybe my retirement plan has me living into my 90s, and I'm comfortable with that. I like the idea of claiming into my or of planning to live into my 90s because if I do, I want to know I have a plan for it. However, when thinking about total lifetime benefits for Social Security, often people start to think more about that mismatch that we talked about, where um, what if I decide to claim late, but then it turns out, I drew the short straw and I don't even live to 70. And that is a very risky feeling picture. They can imagine what that's like, and it feels very risky, right? It's hazard plus outrage. Whereas if they think about the other mismatch, well, what if I claim, early but live a long time? I'm not even sure people perceive that as all that risky or all that problematic because it's just not an outrageous situation. You're living a long time. Hey, big deal. We'll talk a lot more, especially in our masterclass session on psychology, about the effect of having Social Security between 62 and 70 and the effect that has on people's feeling of their ability to spend and so on, because that's a big effect as well. If people are worried about funding risk, that pushes them to want to claim earlier. And if people recognize that there is an opportunity cost, if they look at sequence of returns, if they wonder, hey, Social Security is not the only thing I have. What about my portfolio? What would it feel like to live through the global financial crisis or the Great Depression, having claimed Social Security early or late? That will often push people to claim earlier because they want a smoother ride in their kind of go and slow go years in that first kind of 20 years of retirement. Um, before we get to questions, as I said, Masterclass Session 2 is coming next week. Michael Kothakota from Columbia University and NYU, and he has an RIA called Wolfbridge. Will be presenting on taxation of Social Security. As I said, what we went over today is not everything. There's lots and lots more that is involved with understanding Social Security, planning for it, including in deciding when to claim. So as I said, it's not just a straightforward, everyone should claim early or everyone should claim late. But Mike will be talking about all of that in the context of taxation. So, all right, let's get to some questions. All right. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and take some of the ones that have the highest upvotes. So as I said, remember to upvote. That's just click on the little thumbs up button, and I'll try to hit those first because we've got a ton of questions, and there's no chance I'll get to all of them today. All right, first question. Wife is 6 years older than husband. Can she claim Social Security now and then switch to a spousal benefit when he claims at age 67? I probably should have included, let me make sure I'm in this graph of all of the things that have changed over time. I forgot to include that more recently there were changes in how you could claim spousal benefits. So in the past, you could do something called file and suspend, or there was another one, I think it was called restricted claiming. Those went away. And at this point, anyone who had the ability to do file and suspend, they're already 70 or older. So all of that, I know probably many people on this webinar did some of that planning in the past. It's just not a thing anymore. So essentially what that means is you can only get a spousal benefit if your spouse is currently receiving benefits, so that you can't take a spousal benefit if your spouse is not yet claimed. And you can't only get, the little piece that is your spousal benefit and not have your own. And so, yes, the answer to your question is yes, you can certainly claim now, and then your spousal benefit will kick in. Or she can claim now, and then when her husband starts, she can get a spousal benefit. But there's no way to have the timing of that have a mismatch anymore. So that's actually a great example of a change. I just forgot to include it on my timeline here. So. All right. Let's see. Not entirely sure what DCF is, but have you done a net present value calculation? I suspect this was put in before I mentioned net present value. So that when I was talking about opportunity cost, um, that's exactly what I meant. Net present value of the benefits. So this my thinking on Social Security has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years as I've looked really deeply into it. I used to kind of think it was sort of a not that interesting of a place in financial planning. I now think it's really interesting. There's lots of considerations. And one is the opportunity cost and discount factor. And as soon as you include that, it is not at all obvious that everyone should wait until age 70, which is something that you'll occasionally see out there, this idea that everyone should wait till 70. Um, okay, so this question is about if one spouse has a much higher payment than the other, it can make sense for the higher earner to delay until 70. Excellent point. And I think you're seeing that in this. Um, so let me just, I'm going to reset things and then go back to, so in this case, John has a primary insurance amount of 3,000 and Mary has it of 1,000. I did that for precisely that reason to set up a situation where one person has a lower benefit, therefore they'll have a spousal benefit. And what we often see is that pushes for the person with the lower benefit to start their benefit earlier and then have the person with the higher benefit wait a bit. And so that's what's happening here. So, Mary is claiming at 66, John is claiming at 68, or close enough is 68 and 62. If I go to the details on that, what I'll see is that Mary's benefit starts, back here in 2027, and then both John's benefit and Mary's spousal benefit are going to start in 62. Now, in this case, we actually had John, dying in 2046, and so then Mary's survivor benefit starts. And so, precisely because of what you just said, the optimal or even the close enough, often in that situation, the person with the lower benefit will actually be, it makes a lot of sense for them to claim earlier. In this case, all the way at 62 is really not a bad idea. All right. So Paul has a question about what about taking benefits and invest that amount in something liquid yeah, so that is actually another way to think about what I was showing with the stress tests, right? So now, I think you might have in mind, not retiring, but still taking it. And so that would be an interesting thing to do. You could do that in the software. But you'd see the same effect here, right? Of like, okay, what would the essentially opportunity cost of not receiving that because it's a dollar that I could have invested? What would be the effect of that? So the nice thing about a stress test is it kind of removes us from this theoretical world where we argue about what the right opportunity cost is and it just says, well, how does it change, the conditions on the ground? And that's what this is. All right, I think we might have time for a few more. Will there be a marketing quiz coming down the road? Great idea, Brian. I like it. There definitely are a lot more Social Security things coming from Income Lab. It's just it's such an important thing for clients. A lot of people really want to know about this. Somebody was asking, is there a 8% year-over-year return? Yeah, so it looks like Eric, you already hit it. One thing to note, by the way, is that it's 8% between full retirement age and 70, but it's 8% simple. And so it's always based on primary insurance amount. It's not compounded. So sometimes you get this. I think this is where some of the confusion comes in when people think about should I take early or late? They hear that 8% number and they start to think about it as, well, hang on, I can't guarantee myself 8% in my portfolio, but it's not the same thing. An increase in a future income stream by 8% simple is not the same thing as a 8% return on investment. It's just not. and not in a mathematical sense, and actually not in a psychological sense as well. And maybe I'll end on this. Um, there is also a general preference that people have for assets over income streams. And the reason for that is that assets can be transferred. So if you die, they're still there. Whereas an income stream like Social Security, if you die, it's not there. Obviously there is survivor benefits, but there's not full, it doesn't just keep going. Um, and there's flexibility. So if somebody says, take 2017 here, right? If I just claimed early, then I have, roughly, $300,000 more. Okay, now I would have had this ability to do, say your friends come to you and say, hey, we're doing a blowout trip to the Caribbean or whatever. It's a once in a lifetime thing we're doing. You're going to feel more capable of making those kind of um, big spending decisions if you have an asset than if you have an income stream. Um, and so having higher assets gives people this feeling of flexibility. And I think that's one of these underappreciated preferences people have because they're just always, even if they can't articulate it, they are aware that there are those differences in in the nature of their resources. Um, so with that, we're going to close it up. Please come back next week. You will get an email. I think you may have already, but you'll get an email about next week's masterclass. We're going to have amazing sessions, 4 more amazing sessions over the rest of the summer, and hope that you all enjoyed this. I definitely enjoyed preparing it. It's a great topic, and it looks like we have some questions on Income Lab. If you're interested in Income Lab, the software, go to incomelab.io or just Google us and check it out, or talk to one of our team members. So thanks everybody and have a great day.